It had the flat top of an aircraft carrier, but the bristling armament of a battleship, a steel leviathan born from a fierce ideological refusal to simply copy the enemy. This wasn't just the Soviet Union's first aircraft carrier. It was a floating compromise, a beast of contradictions designed to hunt, fight, and fly in a way the world had never seen. This is the incredible story of the Soviet aircraft carrier Kiev, a vessel that perfectly embodied the ambition, the ingenuity, and the fatal paradoxes of the Red Navy during the Cold War. To understand this ship, you first have to understand the deep-seated skepticism, bordering on outright hostility, that the Soviet Union held for aircraft carriers. In the years after World War II, as the United States Navy built a globe-spanning fleet centered on massive carrier strike groups, Moscow watched with suspicion. To Soviet leaders and naval theorists, these American carriers were the ultimate symbols of capitalist power projection, instruments of imperialism designed to bully sore nations from the sea. They were, in the words of Nikita Khrushchev, little more than floating airfields for aggressors. The Soviet Navy's role was envisioned differently. It was to be a coastal defense force, a mosquito fleet of small, fast missile boats, patrol craft, and submarines, designed to protect the vast borders of the motherland, not to project power across the world's oceans. The idea of spending a fortune on a single, vulnerable target like a carrier seemed wasteful and strategically unsound. This doctrine was powerfully shaped by one man, Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov. For nearly 30 years, Gorshkov commanded the Soviet Navy, transforming it from a regional force into a genuine blue-water superpower. He was a brilliant, politically savvy operator, but he was initially no fan of the aircraft carrier. He believed in the power of the missile and the submarine. He championed the development of long-range, ship-killing cruise missiles that could be launched from cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, overwhelming an American carrier group with a complex, multi-directional attack. This was the Soviet way, asymmetric warfare, countering a strength with a different, unexpected capability. Why build a carrier to fight a carrier, when you could build a dozen submarines or cruisers, armed with unstoppable missiles, for the same price? But by the 1960s, the strategic reality began to shift. The Soviet Union was deploying its own fleet of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs. These boomers were the ultimate guarantors of mutual assured destruction, the nation's second strike capability. Protecting them as they lurked in the deep waters of the Arctic and Atlantic became the Navy's single most important mission. The problem was that the greatest threat to these submarines was NATO's own anti-submarine warfare, or ASW forces. These forces included long-range maritime patrol aircraft and, crucially, hunter-killer submarines, all operating far from Soviet shores, well outside the range of land-based Soviet air cover. Gorshkov realized that to protect his precious SSBNs, he needed to create protective bastions at sea. He needed ships that could provide their own air cover, specifically for anti-submarine warfare. He needed helicopters, and lots of them. This led to the creation of the first Soviet helicopter carriers, the Moskva class. These were strange-looking ships, with the full forward half of a powerful missile cruiser and a wide-open flight deck on the rear half. They were a start, but they were limited. They proved the concept, but the Navy needed something more, something that could not only hunt submarines, but also potentially fight back against NATO aircraft. The debate raged within the Kremlin. The traditionalists still saw carriers as a Western indulgence. The progressives argued that a true global navy needed air power. The result, as is so often the case in such systems, was a compromise born of political necessity and clever semantics. They would not build an aircraft carrier. Absolutely not. Instead, they would build a Tyazlay Avianesushki Kraiser, a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser. This wasn't just a game of words. It was a brilliant piece of geopolitical lawyering. The 1936 Montreux Convention governs the passage of warships through the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The treaty explicitly forbids aircraft carriers heavier than 15,000 tons from passing through the straits. Since the only Soviet shipyards capable of building a vessel of this size were in the Black Sea at Mykolaiv, in what is now Ukraine, this was a major problem. But the treaty's definition of an aircraft carrier was a vessel designed or adapted primarily for the purpose of carrying and operating aircraft at sea. End of section. By loading the front of the ship with the colossal armament of a frontline missile cruiser, the Soviets could argue, with a straight face, that its primary purpose was that of a cruiser. The aircraft were merely for support. It was a loophole, just big enough to sail a 45,000-ton warship through, and it gave birth to one of the most unique warship designs in history, the Project 1143, or Kiev class. Stepping aboard the Kiev would have been a disorienting experience for any Western naval officer. It was a ship of two distinct, warring personalities. The forward third of the vessel was pure, unadulterated Soviet cruiser. Dominating the forecastle were four enormous pairs of cylindrical tubes, 8 in total. These were not guns. They were the launchers for the P-500 Basalt anti-ship missile, known to NATO as the SSN-12 Sandbox. Each missile was over 36 feet long, weighed nearly 5 tons, and carried either a 2,200 and 200-pound conventional warhead or a 35-kilonewton nuclear one. With a range of over 300 miles and a top speed of over Mach 2.5, a salvo of these sea-skimming behemoths could cripple or destroy an entire enemy task force. They were the ship's primary teeth, its carrier-killing weapons. Surrounding these were two twin-armed launchers for the M11 Storm surface-to-air missile system, the Soviet equivalent of the American Terrier missile, providing area-air defense. For close-in defense, there were two more pop-up launchers for the OSA-M short-range SAM system, multiple 76mm dual-purpose gun turrets, and a battery of 30mm rotary cannons. To complete the cruiser package, it had a suite of anti-submarine rocket launchers and a rack of 10 torpedo tubes. This was a warship armed to the absolute brim. Then, starting from behind the large island superstructure, the ship's other personality took over. Here, an angled flight deck, roughly 620 feet long, swept back towards the stern. But unlike an American carrier, it was conspicuously empty. There were no catapults to launch aircraft, and no arresting wires to recover them. The deck was coated in a special heat-resistant material, a clue to its unique purpose. This flight deck was designed for one thing: operating vertical and/or short takeoff and landing, or VSTOL, aircraft. This design was a direct consequence of the cruiser-carrier compromise. Without the full length of a traditional carrier, and without the complex and expensive steam catapult technology, VSTOL was the only option. The air group was intended to be a mix of about 12 fixed-wing fighters and around 20 anti-submarine helicopters. The helicopter component was the most successful and important part of the Kiev's air wing. The primary ASW aircraft was the Kamov K-25 Hormone, later upgraded to the far more capable K-27 Helix. These rugged, distinctive helicopters, with their coaxial contra-rotating rotors that eliminated the need for a tail rotor, were the true heart of the ship's primary mission. They were the eyes and ears of the fleet, dropping sonar buoys, dipping their own sonar into the cold northern waters, and carrying torpedoes and depth charges to prosecute any enemy submarine they found. They were the reason the Kiev class was built, the airborne protectors of the Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet. The other half of the air wing, however, was a far more troubled story. The fixed-wing fighter of the Kiev was the Yakovlev Yak-38, which NATO gave the depressingly accurate reporting name Forger. On paper, it was the Soviet answer to the British Harrier jump jet. In reality, it was a deeply compromised and often dangerous aircraft. Unlike the Harrier, which used a single, powerful turbofan engine with rotating nozzles for both lift and forward flight. The Yak-38 used a much more complex and less efficient system. It had one large main engine, with two rotating nozzles at the rear for forward flight and for contributing to vertical lift, but it also had two smaller, dedicated lift engines, installed vertically in the fuselage just behind the cockpit. These engines were dead weight in normal flight, severely limiting the aircraft's range and payload. The Yak-38 could only take off vertically, with no option for a rolling short takeoff like the Harrier, which further crippled its performance. Its combat radius was a paltry 100 miles, barely enough to form a defensive screen around the carrier itself. Its avionics were rudimentary. Its payload was tiny, consisting of just a couple of small bombs or rocket pods, and it had no onboard cannon. It was, at best, a light interceptor and a light strike aircraft. Worse than its performance limitations was its appalling safety record. The complex engine system was notoriously unreliable, and the aircraft suffered from a high accident rate. It featured an innovative automatic ejection system that would forcibly eject the pilot if the aircraft rolled too far or its engines failed during a hover, a tacit admission of the plane's instability. Imagine being a young Soviet pilot, handed the keys to a machine that was notoriously unforgiving. Would you feel pride or sheer terror? While the forger gave the Soviet Navy its first taste of operating fixed-wing jets from a ship, it was never a truly effective combat aircraft. It was a technological placeholder, a difficult first step on a very long road. The Kiev was a floating fortress with a powerful punch, but its main fighter aircraft was, tragically, its weakest link. This magnificent, heavily armed, and deeply flawed behemoth was now ready for sea. But how would this floating contradiction actually perform on the front lines of the Cold War, hunting the silent American submarines it was designed to kill? The lead ship of her class, Kiev, was commissioned into the Soviet Navy on December 22, 1975. After a series of trials in the Black Sea, she sailed through the Turkish Straits in July 1976, much to the annoyance of NATO, and made her way to join the elite Red Banner Northern Fleet, based at Severomorsk. Our arrival was a moment of immense pride and a signal of the Soviet Navy's growing global ambitions. She immediately became the fleet's flagship, a symbol of its power and technological prowess. For the next decade and a half, Kiev was a familiar and imposing sight in the cold, rough waters of the North Atlantic, the Norwegian Sea, and occasionally, the Mediterranean. Her operational life was a constant dance of cat and mouse with NATO forces. Her primary role was to be the heart of a powerful anti-submarine task force. A typical deployment would see Kiev sailing at the center of a group of Crescent II and Kara-class cruisers, as well as Kashin-class destroyers. This surface group would work in concert with Soviet hunter-killer submarines, like the Victor and Alpha class, and long-range Tu-95 Bear maritime patrol aircraft. Their mission was to sanitize vast areas of the ocean, creating safe operating bastions for their ballistic missile submarines. The Kiev's K-27 helicopters were the key players in this strategy. They would fan out from the carrier in waves, methodically searching for the acoustic signatures of American Los Angeles class or British Swiftsure class submarines. It was a tense, painstaking process. For the men on board, life was a routine of endless patrols in some of an unforgiving seas on Earth, constantly drilling for a war they hoped would never come. While ASW was her day job, her secondary role was equally important: sea control and surface warfare. In any potential conflict between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the Atlantic would have been a crucial battleground, with the US Navy needing to escort convoys of reinforcements and supplies to Europe. The Soviet plan was to sever this lifeline. Kiev and her battle group were designed to hunt and destroy not just NATO submarines, but also these surface convoys and their escorts. This is where the ship's cruiser half came into play. The strategy wasn't for the Yak-38 fighters to dogfight with American F-14s That would have been suicide. Instead, the Yak-38s would be used as spotters, flying out to detect the enemy fleet and relay targeting data back to the Kiev. Once the target was acquired, Kiev would unleash its primary weapon, a full salvo of 8 nuclear-capable sandbox missiles. The goal was to stand off from a safe distance and saturate the enemy's defenses with a wave of supersonic, sea-skimming death. It was a doctrine that relied on the overwhelming power of the missile, not the finesse of air-to-air combat. Throughout her career, Kiev participated in some of the largest naval exercises ever conducted by the Soviet Union. One of the most significant was Zapad 81, a massive joint service war game held in September 1981. It was designed to simulate a full-scale conflict with NATO, and Kiev played a starring role, demonstrating the Soviet Navy's ability to project power far from home. These exercises were as much about propaganda as they were about training. When Kiev sailed past NATO naval bases or was shadowed by curious Western aircraft, it was a clear message. The Soviet Navy was no longer just a coastal force. It was a global power, with a flagship that, while unconventional, was undeniably formidable. She was the pride of the fleet, a testament to Admiral Gorshkov's vision of a balanced, ocean-going navy. But the ship, and the system that created her, were living on borrowed time. The Kiev-class ships were enormously expensive to operate. They required a crew of merely 2,000 men and consumed vast quantities of fuel. Maintaining their complex web of weapon systems, radars, and aircraft was a constant struggle. For a nation whose economy was already groaning under the immense weight of military spending, these ships were a luxury. As the 1980s wore on, the cracks began to show. The Soviet Union was mired in its own Vietnam and Afghanistan, and economic stagnation was setting in. By the end of the decade, the winds of change were blowing through the Eastern Bloc. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, spelled the end for much of the mighty Red Fleet. The new Russian Federation inherited the Soviet Navy, but it did not inherit the Soviet economy. Budgets were slashed to the bone. Ships were tied up at their moorings, left to rust for lack of fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. The Kiev, once the symbol of Soviet naval might, was not immune. She was suffering from severe mechanical problems, particularly with her boilers, and needed a major, costly overhaul that the fledgling Russian government simply could not afford. And this, in my opinion, was the fatal flaw not just of the ship, but of the system that built it. A gargantuan military machine that the underlying economy simply could not sustain. In 1993, after less than 18 years of service, the Kiev was officially withdrawn from the Russian Navy. Her sister ships suffered similar fates. The Minsk was sold to a Chinese company and eventually became the center part of a theme park in Shenzhen. The Novorossiysk, which had served in the Pacific Fleet, was sold for scrap to South Korea. Only the fourth and most advanced ship of the class, the Baku, which was later renamed Admiral Gorshkov, would have a future as a warship. After years of languishing, she was eventually sold to India, extensively rebuilt into a true short takeoff but arrested recovery carrier, and recommissioned as the IN Vikramaditya. The grand Soviet experiment of the heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser was over. For the Kiev herself, a quiet, ignominious end seemed certain. She was sold in 1996 for a reported $1.6 million, destined for the scrapyard. But her story was about to take one last, bizarre turn. Instead of being broken up for scrap, the hull of the former flagship of the Red Banner Northern Fleet was purchased by a Chinese company and towed all the way to the port city of Tianjin in northern China. There, beginning in 2004, she became the centerpiece of the Binhai Aircraft Park, a military-themed tourist attraction. Her flight deck was populated with models of Chinese aircraft, and her cavernous interior, once home to sailors and pilots on the front line of the Cold War, was converted into exhibition halls. Visits could walk the decks of this once secretive vessel, pose for photos next to her giant missile launchers, and marvel at this captured giant from a bygone era. For a ship designed to project fear and power, it was a strange and slightly surreal form of retirement. But the final transformation was yet to come. In 2011, the transformation was completed when the ship was converted into a fully fledged luxury hotel. The officers' quarters and crew spaces were turned into lavish guest suites. Restaurants were opened on its decks. The mighty warship, forged in the fires of the Cold War to hunt submarines and challenge American carriers, was now a floating resort. It is a deeply ironic end for a vessel that was such a pure product of Soviet ideology. A ship built by a communist state to fight capitalism was ultimately sold off and turned into a for-profit commercial enterprise, a tourist trap, the ultimate capitalist venture. It stands today as perhaps the strangest and most fascinating relic of the Cold War naval race. The legacy of the Kiev is complex. She was not a failure, but she was certainly not a resounding success. She was a stepping stone, a necessary and ambitious compromise that allowed the Soviet Navy to gain invaluable experience in naval aviation. The lessons learned from the flaws of the Kiev class, the limitations of Viet-style aircraft, the need for catapults and arresting gear, directly informed the design of the Soviet Union's first true aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. The Kiev was a product of her time, a reflection of a naval doctrine that was trying to find its own path, distinct from the West. She was a cruiser that carried aircraft, a carrier that bristled with missiles, a hybrid leviathan that was impressive, powerful, and ultimately a dead end. From flagship to theme park, her strange journey is a powerful reminder of how quickly empires can fall, and how the mighty instruments of war can end their days in most unexpected of ways. The story of the Kiev is a reminder that sometimes the most fascinating pieces of military hardware aren't the most successful, but the most unique. They are the ones that tell a deeper story about the country that built them, their ambitions, their fears, and their limitations. So, what other strange, hybrid, or dead-end military designs do you find fascinating? The vehicles that were brilliant ideas on paper, but just didn't quite work in reality. Let me know your favorites in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into a Cold War relic, consider joining our command structure by hitting that subscribe button. We've got plenty more blueprints to unroll and stories to tell. You won't want to miss the next engagement.